2 Samuel chapter 2 is where we're going to be this evening. If you remember, David was anointed by Samuel to be the king in Israel following Saul. That was all the way back in 1 Samuel 16, some decades before what we're looking at now. David is 30 years old when we are reading what we're reading in 2 Samuel 2. He would have been about 30 years old, where his anointing as king, he could have been as young as 10, but some would say perhaps between 10 and 15. Following the death of Saul, David had been anointed here in our study here in 2 Samuel 1. He was anointed king in Hebron, but he was only anointed king over the tribal territory of Judah. So he's king of one of the 12 tribes, not the whole of Israel. In the north, Abner, who was Saul's uncle and his commander-in-chief, took Ishbosheth, or another name for him was Eshbaal, and had declared him king over all Israel. So right now, as we're reading in 2 Samuel chapter 2, Israel has two kings. One, David in the south, the one who was anointed by God, and then the one in the north, also kind of the northeast, he's on the other side of the Jordan River, his name is Ishbosheth. 7 years have passed since the death of Saul and David's anointing in Hebron, and of that 7 years, Ishbosheth has reigned for 2 of them in a village called Mahanaim, which is on the eastern shore of the River Jordan. We would call it modern-day Jordan. Now, a land cannot long bear 2 kings, and so David and Ishbosheth send an envoy to reach an agreement in Gibeon. So right here, it's in the offset here in the map, you see Gibeon. It's about 5 miles or so from Jerusalem, or Jerusalem doesn't exist at this point, it's Jebus, but that same area. And so they send envoys. David sends Joab and a contingent of soldiers, and Ishbosheth sends Abner and a contingent of soldiers. They meet there in Gibeon, and Abner and Joab attempt to settle the matter with a fight to the death between 2 small forces. If you remember, each of them had 12 men, so you have 24 men total, and they were going to fight it out. And the goal was, we can have minimal bloodshed, and we can decide the outcome of this situation. Sort of like when Goliath called out to the armies of Israel and said, "Send me your champion. If he beats me, we'll be your servants. If I beat him, then you'll be our servants." That's kind of what they're going for. It's not unheard of throughout history. So Abner and Joab's men, they get together. Both of them, maybe they were trained by the same guys, because they grab each other by the head, the Bible tells us, and each of them shove their swords in, and they all drop dead. So now you have 24 dead men. Everyone on both sides is dead, and you're no closer to a conclusion than they were before. So because of no conclusion in the small combat, the nation of Israel now descends into civil war. Look at verse 17. We'll pick up where we were last week. "And there was a very sore battle that day, and Abner was beaten, and the men of Israel before the servants of David." We're going to pick up here with the story of Abner and Asahel. Here in verse 18 it says, "And there were 3 sons of Zeruiah there. Joab," we know him, we've talked about him, and we're going to look at all these boys. "Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as light of foot as a wild roe," or a deer. Remember, Zeruiah, this was, I don't know how many times I've read through 1 and 2 Samuel and never put it together. Zeruiah is not a man. Zeruiah is David's sister. So the sons of Zeruiah are David's nephews, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Joab, the name means Jehovah is Father. Now we've been introduced to him just a little bit. He's leading David's envoy. But Joab is going to play a key role in the story of David going forward. He will eventually be the first one to strike a blow inside the city of Jebus and take the city, which will be renamed Jerusalem. Joab will become the captain of David's army. So Joab, we have Abishai. Abishai means my father is a gift. He's the one who had gone with David into Saul's camp when Saul was sleeping. You remember this story? Saul was sleeping and his whole army around him while he was chasing David. And David and Abishai went into Saul's camp, and they stood there over Abishai and had a conversation. Part of that conversation was 1 Samuel 26:8. Then said Abishai to David, God hath delivered thine enemy into thine hand this day. Now therefore let me smite him, I pray thee, with the spear even to the earth at once, and I will not smite him the second time. Okay, that's Abishai's solution. Is David, we have here before us a perfect opportunity. I have a spear, he's already on the ground. Let me just keep him on the ground and we'll be done with this. But of course David would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. Abishai he's one of those guys. He's fun to read about in Scripture. We'll read about him as we go through 2 Samuel. He's one of David's mighty men. In 1 Chronicles 11, Abishai lifted up his spear against 300 at one time and won. So that's the kind of man who we have here, one of the sons of Zeruiah. And the one that we're going to focus on here first, is Asahel, which means God-made. We know very little about him, other than what we're told right here. He was very fast. He was quick on his feet. All of these brothers, I said Abishai, but all of the brothers actually make the list of the mighty men. All of David's nephews were there. We find that list in 2 Samuel 23. I'm looking forward to when we get there, because that's a tremendously fun study. But look at verse 19. Let's see what we've got to look at here this evening. And Asahel pursued after Abner, and in going he turned not to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. He's single-focused in what he's doing. Then Abner looked behind him and said, Art thou Asahel? And he answered, I am. And Abner said to him, Turn thee aside to thy right hand or to thy left, and lay thee hold on one of the young men, and take thee his armor. But, excuse me. But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. In this time, in this period of time, as they were fighting, warriors one against another, and they're fighting with armor, one of the most prized trophies of war was the armor of an opposing general. They had a very decorative armor many times, and so it was kind of a feather in your cap if you could come out of the battle carrying the armor of the opposing army's general. And that seems to be what Asahel had in mind. He's on his way, and Abner turns around. Abner is an older man, but he's an older man who is very, very experienced in battle. He turns. He has no desire to kill Asahel, probably not because he was a nice person, so much as, who is Asahel's brother again? You remember we just said we've got Joab and we've got Abishai. Would you want Abishai mad at you? Given what we know, he's not a good person to be on his bad side. And so Abner is running, an older man running, and he has this very, very fast young man. He turns back to him and says, Look, don't come after me. I don't want to have to kill you. Go after one of the younger men and get their armor. Don't pick on me, because I don't want to have to do what you're going to force me to do. Verse 23. He says, Howbeit, he refused to turn aside. Wherefore Abner, with the hinder end of the spear, smote him under the 5th rib, that the spear came out behind him, and he fell down there and died in the same place. And it came to pass that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell down and died, stood still. Now, there are many who say that this was something of an accident, that sometimes the spears were sharpened. They had their main point on the front end. Sometimes they had a little bit of a point on the back end. And it would seem, in some of the commentaries I was reading, they would say, well, it appears that they were running, and Abner stopped and went like this, and Asahel was running so fast, he got himself. But if you look at the aim here, he smote him under the 5th rib. That doesn't sound accidental. That sounds more like he was a skilled warrior and was good at what he did. And so Abner, he kills Asahel. So one of the sons of Zeruiah, one of David's nephews, falls dead here on the battlefield. Now, as you read this, you're probably like me. You're not rooting for Abner. Abner's not the hero of this. But in his defense, just as we read this, he was killing in self-defense. If he hadn't killed Asahel, Asahel certainly would have made an attempt to kill him. And he was also, and this is important because it's going to come back later, Abner killed Asahel in battle. Okay? This wasn't what we would call murder. This was a warrior killing another warrior in a time of battle, similar to how all of the other warriors killed in time of battle. That matters. You need to file that away, that Abner killed Asahel, and while we're not rooting for Abner, it was justified, at least so far as the fact that it was done in battle. Asahel was the fastest, but he was not the only one on Abner's trail. But when the rest of the force caught up to him, they didn't pursue after Abner. They stopped as they saw the body of their king's nephew, Asahel, laying there. He's dead, and they all just stop there and gather around. We read of the end of the battle in verse 24. And Joab also and Abishai pursued after Abner. And the sun went down when they were come to the hill of Ammah, that lieth before Giah by the way of the wilderness of Gibeon. All of these landmarks that we're looking at here, the hill of Ammah and Giah, they're all in and around Gibeon. We're not talking about a vast tract of territory within just a couple of miles there. They're fighting. And Joab and Abishai are pursuing Abner and his men, but they're on a different route from Asahel. Asahel, it would seem, was leading one contingent, and Joab and Abishai are coming from another direction. As they're coming up, they end up on opposite hilltops. Look at verse 25. And the children of Benjamin gathered themselves together after Abner, and became one troop, and stood on the top of an hill. Why would the tribe of Benjamin align themselves with Abner and Ishbosheth? Because Saul was a Benjamite. So Ishmael was also a Benjamite. Abner was a Benjamite. So they're running with their home crowd. So Abner and his troops, the Benjamites, they're on one hilltop. And then we read that the others, Joab and Abishai and their men, rally on another hilltop. You say, well, why didn't they shoot at each other? Well, here's what the hilltops look like. Okay? So that's why they didn't just run across and kill the other guy, because it's a long way from hilltop to hilltop. So you have Abishai and his men on one hill. You have Joab and have Abner and his men on another hilltop, and they're talking across. They can carry their voices, but they're not running to get each other. Verse 26. Then Abner called to Joab and said, Shall the sword devour forever? Knowest thou not that it will be bitterness in the latter end? How shall it be then, ere thou bid the people, or how long shall it be then, ere thou bid the people return from following their brethren? Civil war is an ugly thing. There's Jews killing Jews. Men of Judah are killing men of Benjamin. They're close. They would have known each other. Many of these men could have perhaps grown up together. Civil war is an ugly thing. And so Abner is looking for a truce to prevent further bloodshed. Now Abner also has a vested interest in seeing this battle come to a close before word comes to Joab of what? I killed your brother. That's not going to go over well with Abishai and Joab. So Abner has a good reason to say, look, let's end hostilities. Let's do it now. Verse 27. And Joab said, As God liveth, unless thou hadst spoken, surely then in the morning the people had gone up, every one from following his brother. Verse 24 tells us that the sun had gone down, so Joab's intent had been to follow the army of Abner until dawn. They were going to fight all through the night. They were going to go out, send out their parties, and see if they could find stragglers from the army of Abner. But they bring it to a close. Verse 28, so Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood still and pursued after Israel no more. Neither fought they any more. Abner and his men walked all that night through the plain and passed over Jordan and went through Bithron, and they came to Mahanaim. So a trumpet from Joab signals his men, hey, enough, stop fighting, no more. And Abner and the defeated forces of Ishbosheth make the trek home. Now, if you look at this, you see the end of the arrow right there to the right of Philistia. That's right around Gibeon, where they would have been fighting. And so Abner and his men, they make the trip. They go over to the Jordan. That's what it means when it says that they went to the plain. That's talking about the plain of Jordan. And then they went up, it says, all through Bithron. That's a deep ravine that leads up to Mahanaim. So they're going back home with their tails between their legs, as it were. What's the result of this battle? How did it ends? It's over. Verse 30. And Joab returned from following Abner. And when he had gathered all the people together, there lacked of David's servants 19 men and Asahel. So you can interpret that as 19, and Asahel is one of them, or you can interpret that as 19 plus Asahel. Either way, you've had battle, and David's side lost 20 men. 20 men. But, verse 31, but the servants of David had smitten of Benjamin and of Abner's men, so that 360 men died. 360 of Ishbosheth's forces lie dead at the hands of other Jews. Verse 32, and they took up Asahel and buried him in the sepulchre of his father, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron in the break of day. So if you look at a map, Hebron is on the way to Hebron. You would have to go through Bethlehem if you were coming from Gibeon. So they dropped the body of Asahel off in the family burial plot there in Bethlehem, and they made their way down to the place where David rules as king. Look at verse 1 of the next chapter. Now there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. So we've seen one battle. One battle is not the war. The war is going to go on for some time. There was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. There will be many more conflicts between these two sides. But this was a war that Ishbosheth and the house of Saul cannot win. And we know that because God had already rejected Saul and his descendants from being king. If you remember all the way back in 1 Samuel 16, by the way, that's before the story of David and Goliath. All the way back in 1 Samuel 16, we read, and the Lord said unto Samuel, how long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Before David fought Goliath, Saul was already rejected. Saul's reign was over. Saul's family's reign was over. He says, fill thine horn with oil and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. That, of course, being the youngest of Jesse's sons, David. So this battle between the forces of David and the forces of Saul through Ishbosheth, we already know the outcome, and as we'll see in just a few minutes, it's crazy to think, but they actually knew the outcome. Abner knew what had happened in 1 Samuel 16, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we get there, let's talk about David's sons. Look at verse 2. And unto David were sons born in Hebron, And his firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. And his second, Chileab of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. And the third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And the fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. And the fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, by Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David in Hebron. Now, if you were counting, you counted 6 sons. By how many mothers? 6. Now, here's the family tree. Family trees should not be this complicated. We've made that statement many, many times, and we didn't even mention one of his wives, okay? We have over here, we have Michal, who was his first wife. That's the daughter of Saul. So here we have all of these children. We have Amnon. He's going to play a major part in the story of David going forward. We have Chileab, who is also called Daniel in 1 Chronicles. It's believed that Chileab probably died young, because this is really one of the only times that he's mentioned. He wasn't involved in the inner family quarrels that happened among David's children. Absalom, you're familiar with Absalom, right? He's going to play a major part. We don't know a whole lot about Shephatiah. We don't know a whole lot about Ithream, but they do have something to do. And we have Adonijah. Adonijah is going to play a major role in the story of David. If you read all the way at the end of 2 Samuel, you'll find Adonijah's name thrown around an awful lot. Absalom, we mentioned, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. Now remember, this was the day of political treaties. And political treaties were often done by marriage. Meaning, if I need to have an alliance with Washington, I will find an eligible young man and I'll marry one of my daughters off to him. And now I have an alliance with Washington. I'm thankful we don't operate on this basis anymore. But in the days of David, that's how it was. And Absalom was the daughter of the king of Geshur. The only reason I bring this up is because Geshur would be far to the north. If you see here, you see Mahanaim right there in the middle of the map. Who's in Mahanaim? You remember? That's where Ishbosheth is. That's Ishbosheth's capital. And Geshur is to the north. So David, in marrying Maacah and bearing Absalom, he now has an ally on the other side of his enemy, Ishbosheth. So I'm not saying that God would have had him to join in this marriage. God's plan is one man, one woman for one life, but that's not how David was operating. The reason also that we read about this in Geshur is that Absalom, when he flees from David, he's going to go back to the people of his mother. He will return to Geshur. You'll note here in verse 5, it says, these were born to David in Hebron. The reason it specifies that these were born to David in Hebron is because David is going to have lots more sons by several more women when he moves his capital to Jerusalem. David's not done. His family tree is going to get more convoluted. So he's going to have lots more branches here. Let's take a look at Abner's power move here as we close this evening. Abner's power move. So David's family tree, he's in Hebron. He's got all of these sons by all of these women. You have Ishbosheth there in Mahanaim. David is building alliances. They're in a long-standing war, many skirmishes between the two sides. Look at verse 6. And it came to pass, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner made himself strong for the house of Saul. Ishbosheth was the puppet with the crown on his head, but Abner was the man who was holding the strings. So Abner is the man who's the mover and shaker behind Ishbosheth, who really, there's not a whole lot good to say about him. Abner had been associated with Saul since the beginning of his reign. Perhaps he was hesitant to see his power come to an end. So, verse 7, and Saul had a concubine. The idea of a mistress. Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. I would imagine that that name came out sometime after the mother burned her hand on the stove or whatever it was. I don't know exactly. The daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner. So Saul had this concubine named Rizpah. There's a problem. Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Wherefore hast thou gone unto my father's concubine?" Now, we look at this and we say, it's kind of gross, but why does it matter? Well, the reason it matters is this was a very common practice in this culture and in this time. When somebody wanted to indicate that they were going to succeed a king, they would take that king's concubines, that king's wives. So that was the way it went. Abner's tired of standing in the shadows of the powerless Ishbosheth, so he decides he's going to assert his claim to the throne of Saul by taking Rizpah, Saul's concubine. This practice is going to show up multiple times as we go through the book of 2 Samuel. If you remember, when Absalom came to power, when he usurped his father and took over Jerusalem, one of the first things that he did was defile his father's concubines in the palace there of Jerusalem. At the end of his life, when David was preparing to die, one of his concubines was Adonijah, his son who was not to be king, asked for one of the king's concubines. It was just, again, we look at it, we say it's gross, and it is, but it's also the way the culture worked. Abner is making a power play by saying, I'm going to take Saul's concubine. That gives me a way into the seat of power. Ishbosheth knows exactly what is meant by this, and so he confronts him on it. Wherefore hast thou gone in unto my father's concubine? Verse 8. Then was Abner very wroth for the words of Ishbosheth, and said, Am I a dog's head? Again, dogs in this day, we look at dogs as pets and cute. They did not look at dogs as pets nor cute. They looked at them as scavengers. This was a big insult. Am I a dog's head, which against Judah do show kindness this day unto the house of Saul thy father, to his brethren, to his friends, and have not delivered thee into the hand of David, that thou chargest me today with a fault concerning this woman? That's a wordy way of saying, you wouldn't be anything if I hadn't put you right where you are. I could hand you over to David any time I want, and we both know what's going to happen if that's the case. How dare you accuse me of this act of treason? How dare you accuse me of this? Verse 9, Abner goes on, So do God to Abner, and more also, except as the Lord has sworn to David, even so I do to him, to translate the kingdom from the house of Saul, and to set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan even to Beersheba. Look at verse 9 again. Look what he said there. As the Lord hath sworn to David, even so I do to him. Kind of indicates that Abner knows what's going on, doesn't it? Abner knows that Ishbosheth isn't the one who's supposed to be on the throne of Israel. Abner had a very personal reason for wanting to keep a child or a descendant of Saul in power, because Abner's star was kind of hitched to the star of Saul. But now he says, look, we both know I put you where you are. We both know you're not supposed to be there, and I'm done with you. I'm done. Enough with Ishbosheth, enough with your whole family. God said he was going to give David the kingdom, and I'm going to help David get the kingdom. I'm going to give David the kingdom from Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the far south. Abner had lived his life up to this point in known and willful opposition to the law of God. He knew what God wanted. But he had chosen that because it benefited him, it gave him the position of power, he had made a conscious choice. I'm going to side with Saul's family against the revealed will of God. Not out of conviction, he makes this change. Not out of conviction for wrongdoing, just he's had enough of Ishbosheth. So now he's also been caught in his treachery. Look at how Ishbosheth responds. And he, verse 11, Ishbosheth, could not answer Abner a word again because he feared him. Abner is an old general who's killed a lot of people in his time. And Ishbosheth says, I should probably shut up now. Because why? Well, because Abner will kill me, and I know it. Abner has just switched his allegiance. Would you want Abner on your side? What do you think? Depends on how you look at it, right? Abner's quite a general, right? If you're going into a fight, he's a good guy to have on your side. He can hit somebody from behind through the fifth rib with his spear. He's good with a weapon. How about his scruples? You want him on your side? Would you hire Abner? I wouldn't. You look at it, he's kind of greasy, isn't he? He's looking for where he can get the most for himself. Whose team is Abner on? Is he on Ishbosheth's team or David's team? He's on Abner's team, absolutely. He's looking for how can I best get the most power. For a time he thought I can get it by pushing Ishbosheth into the throne. Then he had a point where he says, you know what, enough of Ishbosheth. I can have it if I'm on the throne. So he took Saul's concubine. Now he says, you know what, I can have it if I'll give David the throne. Abner is a man who is working both ends against the middle. What happens when you work both ends against the middle? Well, eventually you'll find yourself in a knot. And we'll find that to be the case here with Abner. In conclusion here this evening, we've given the point from Psalm 37 that David is a great illustration of a man where the Bible says that the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. David has his hang-ups, without question, and we haven't even gotten to most of them. We've seen some. David has lots more big baggage. But he was a man after God's own heart. Why? Well, because he was quick to repent. He was looking for restoration. And David loved the Lord. David wanted God to guide his steps. David, who had worked with sheep for the first part of his life, understood what it was to be able to say, the Lord is my shepherd. That's the relationship that David had with God. He had the example of the steps of a good man being ordered by the Lord. And Abner is exactly the opposite. Abner is a man he's self-willed, he's egotistical, he's looking for what will give me the best position. As a matter of fact, there's another verse that kind of describes Abner. It's Proverbs 16:25. There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Maybe you remember what happens to Abner. If you don't, read ahead. You'll find it here in chapter 3. It doesn't end well. He's going to fall to his own treachery. But at the same time, Abner's death is going to be something that David remembers. When David is, one of the last things that David says to his son Solomon, when Solomon is coming into the throne, David is going to bring up Abner to it. Because Abner's life is intertwined with the life of David. David, a man after God's own heart. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. Abner, a man who sought his own way, and who found that the end thereof were the ways of death. Any thoughts, questions that you have here this evening on 2 Samuel 2 and 3? Could I give you a quiz on David's sons' names and their mothers? Me either. I couldn't give them all to you. And again, it gets more complicated. If you look at 2 Samuel 5, you'll find a whole bunch more kids that we're going to have. I'm going to have to shrink the size of the font and put a lot more lines on there so that we can keep all the kids straight. Like I said, family trees should not be that complicated. But it's good because the Bible records its heroes and it includes their faults. God doesn't endorse polygamy, but he does record it. So, good reason not to. Any thoughts?
He had no children with Michael?
No children with Michael. which we'll cover because that is incredibly significant. Because who was Michal's father? Saul. It's kind of interesting that God would give no descendants to the descendants of Saul. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? All right. Well, I won't be here to go through it with you next week, but in 2 weeks, Lord willing, actually 3 weeks, because 3 weeks, on the third week, we'll be having a celebration of the Lord's table. I want to encourage you to come out. As we go over, we will be missing all of you and praying for you. I am going to the other side of the world, but through the miracles of technology, if you need anything, my phone still works. So if you need something, shoot me a text or an email. We are still in the loop, or if anything happens that you'd like us to pray for, please don't hesitate to give us a ring. So, all right, let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Our Father in heaven, we thank you once again for your word. We thank you for the truth of your word and for, Lord, the application that we can draw. I pray that we would learn the lessons that we see here in the Old Testament as we go through, and some of the stories familiar and some of them not so familiar. I pray that we would learn the lessons. That we would be like David, who, though he had his flaws and faults, and some of them big and glaring, Lord, he still had a heart for you. He still sought your face, and his steps were guided by you. Lord, I pray that we would not be like Saul or Abner, those men who sought to work their own way. I pray that we would place our lives firmly in your hands, and that we would allow you to lead. I pray that you'd guide our steps. Give us safety, Lord, till we meet again. Pray that you would just undertake for us in every way. In Jesus' name.